common laboratory abnormality reported was a transient decrease in lymphocytes 1 to 3 days after dose 1, which were mostly grade 1 to 2 in severity, and they generally normalized within 6 to 8 days and did not occur after dose 2. And among the phase 1 participants in this study who received the 30 microgram dose, transient decreases in lymphocytes post-dose 1 occurred in 5 of 12 participants in the younger age group, 18 to 55 years of age, and in 4 of 12 participants in the older age group, 65 to 85 years of age. These transient hematological changes were not associated with clinical symptoms. Additionally, overall subgroup analyses of the previous safety results were assessed by race, ethnicity, medical comorbidities, and prior SARS-CoV-2 infection, without any safety concerns identified by the subgroup analyses. So in summary, our efficacy conclusions are that the totality of the clinical data submitted with the EUA request meets the expectations for the duration of follow-up. In the final efficacy analysis, vaccine efficacy after 7 days post-dose 2 was 95% in participants without prior evidence of SARS-CoV-2 infection. Efficacy outcomes were consistently greater than 93% across demographic subgroups. And efficacy against severe COVID-19 occurring after the first dose was 88.9%. The small number of severe cases is a limitation to these data. A trend of potential efficacy following a single dose is observed in the data. However, a conclusion is limited because almost all participants received a second dose. And our summary for safety here is that the totality of the clinical data submitted with the EUA request meets the expectations for follow-up for duration of follow-up and evaluation of the all-enrolled population. And this provided additional safety data from a total of greater than 43,000 participants. Reactogenicity was generally more frequent after dose 2 in all ages, mostly mild to moderate, with less frequency and severity in adults over 55 years of age than in the younger adults. There were no specific safety concerns identified in subgroup analyses by age, race, ethnicity, medical comorbidities, or prior SARS-CoV-2 infection. As of the data cutoff, 4 cases of Bell's palsy were reported in vaccine recipients and none in the placebo recipient. Although there is no clear basis upon which to conclude a causal relationship at this time, we do recommend further surveillance if the vaccine is authorized for widespread use. So moving on in the outline here, I will move on to the pharmacovigilance plan, future studies, and ongoing study plans. The sponsor submitted a pharmacovigilance plan to monitor safety concerns that could be associated with the vaccine. The sponsor identified vaccine-associated enhanced disease, including vaccine-associated enhanced respiratory disease, as an important potential risk. Use in pregnancy and lactation are areas the sponsor identified as missing information. In addition to the safety concerns specified by the sponsor, FDA has requested that the sponsor update the pharmacovigilance plan to include missing information in pediatric participants less than 16 years of age, which the applicant agreed to. We also recently requested that the sponsor add anaphylactic reactions, including anaphylaxis, to the pharmacovigilance plan based on the recent post-market reports of anaphylactic reactions. The next slide is a graphic here to outline pharmacovigilance activities. AE reporting under the EUA may come from vaccine recipients, vaccination providers, or from the sponsor. First, vaccine recipients will be notified that AEs can be reported to VAERS through the VAC sheet for recipients and caregivers. Another source of AE reports from recipients is the vSafe program, which is a smartphone-based program that uses text messaging and web surveys from the CDC to check in with vaccine recipients for health problems after vaccination. Reports from vaccine recipients are voluntary. AE reporting by vaccination providers and the sponsor is mandatory. Both the sponsor and vaccine providers administering the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine must report to VAERS the following information associated with the vaccine. Any vaccine administration errors, whether or not associated with an adverse event, serious adverse events irrespective of attribution to the vaccination, cases of multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children and adults, cases of COVID-19 that result in hospitalization or death. In addition, the applicant will also conduct periodic aggregate review of safety data and submit periodic safety reports at monthly intervals for FDA review. Each periodic safety report is required to contain a narrative summary and an analysis of adverse events submitted during the reporting interval, including interval and cumulative counts by age groups, special populations, i.e. pregnant women, and adverse events of special interest. Newly identified safety concerns in the interval, and actions taken since the last report because of adverse experience. Both FDA and CDC will take a collaborative and complementary approach on reviewing AEs. FDA will individually review all serious adverse events on a daily basis. And FDA will also examine other sources for adverse events, such as the literature, and will perform data mining to determine if adverse events are disproportionately reporting for the candidate vaccine compared to all other vaccines in VAERS. Any potential safety signals identified will be investigated. The next slide outlines the sponsors' pharmacovigilance activities that are also included as active surveillance studies, each of which will be conducted over a 30-month time period. The first study will be conducted in a survey of 20,000 healthcare workers. Incidence rates of adverse events will be compared to expected rates. The second study listed will be conducted within the Department of Health health system databases for U.S. military and their families. Rates of adverse events of special interest in vaccine recipients will be compared to unvaccinated comparators. The final study listed will evaluate for AEs of special interest using the Veterans Health Administration electronic medical record database. Vaccine recipients will be compared to unvaccinated participants or to recipients of the seasonal influenza vaccine. And moving on, the next slide here will outline the proposed revisions to the study protocol if an EUA is issued. The study design figure shows the current study design, and for participants that originally received the vaccine candidate or for placebo recipients who decline receiving the vaccine under the EUA when it is made available, there is no change to the study design. Participants will continue to be followed as previously proposed through 2 years post-dose 2. The next slide here shows Pfizer's proposal for subjects eligible to receive the vaccine under local and national recommendations at the time of the EUA. They can contact their investigator to confirm that they meet eligibility criteria. They would then be unblinded to know if they received vaccine or placebo. If they received placebo, they would then receive the vaccine within the study conduct and continue with the study for 18 months of follow-up. At visit 4, alternatively, at visit 4 or 6 months after dose 2, subjects that had not met local or national recommendations for the EUA issuance would then be offered the option to receive the vaccine at that time point. And if they accept, both the sponsor and the participant would be unblinded, and participants who originally received placebo would then receive vaccine. Participants who cross over from the placebo group to receive the vaccine would then get baseline blood drawn for immunogenicity prior to the first dose and nasal swabs for PCR prior to each dose. They would then have phone follow-up at 1, 6, and 18 months following dose 2, as indicated in the figure, in addition to any illness visits for potential COVID-19 symptoms that meet the case definition. So the total study duration would still be approximately 2 years for these participants. So moving on, I will wrap up now with our benefit and risk assessment in the context of the proposed EUA. The known benefits of the vaccine at this time include a reduced risk of confirmed COVID-19 at least 7 days after completing a 2-dose vaccination regimen in individuals without prior history of SARS-CoV-2 infection. Efficacy findings are consistent across subgroups, including racial and ethnic minorities, adults 65 years of age and older, and individuals with one or more of the following conditions: obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and chronic cardiopulmonary disease. Efficacy data in adolescents 16 and 17 years of age are limited, but could be extrapolated from the efficacy observed in adults 18 to 55 years of age. In addition, here is a slide for our risks. The known risks of the vaccine include local and systemic adverse reactions. In all age groups, these were generally mild to moderate and more frequent following dose 2 than following dose 1. In adults over 55 years of age, they were less frequent and less severe compared to the younger adult age group. Severe adverse events that were possibly related to the vaccination included the shoulder injury that we attributed to vaccine administration or to the vaccine itself, and lymphadenopathy that was thought to be temporally associated and biologically plausible. There are no specific safety concerns identified in analyses of subgroups described or by prior SARS-CoV-2 infection. The data are limited from adolescents 16 and 17 years of age, but could be extrapolated from the safety profile in adults 18 to 55 years of age. The risk assessment is also limited by the duration of follow-up at this snapshot in time and the fact that pregnant and breastfeeding women were excluded from the study. In addition, we are aware of the reports of anaphylactic reactions, and we are continuing to collect information to monitor the situation closely. I will now move on to my final slides here to remind the advisory committee of the items that we would like for them to discuss without a vote. The first of which is that Pfizer has proposed a plan for continuation of blinded placebo-controlled follow-up in ongoing trials if the vaccine were made available under the EUA. Please discuss Pfizer's plan, including how loss of blinded placebo-controlled follow-up in ongoing trials should be addressed. The second item to discuss is to discuss any gaps in plans described today and in the briefing documents for further evaluation of vaccine safety and effectiveness in populations who receive the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine under EUA. And the final slide here is our question for the advisory committee to vote on. Based on the totality of the scientific evidence available, do the benefits of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine outweigh its risks for use in individuals 16 years of age and older? With that, I will conclude my presentation and welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's have questions for about 10 minutes or so. We're running late. But I think it's critical for us to entertain some questions now. And if anybody, I shut off questions to the sponsor, so we might want to follow up with questions to the sponsor as well, and we can sort it out the direction of the questions, whether it goes to FDA or to the sponsor. Let's start out with Mr. Taubman.
Thank you. So I've raised this before, and that is that the data is now 26 days old. That was the closing date. And I asked a question about, do we have more recent data? And Dr. Fink said it hadn't been requested. However, the sponsor is here, and based upon my experience, they will have updated data. And some other folks may want to ask them about it. But I have one specific set of data I'd like to ask about in terms of updating. It's probably for them and not for you, Dr. Wollersheim, but we'll see. It's about this question of severe disease. And the takeaway, there's a lot, Pfizer suggested it's been demonstrated that their vaccine is effective with severe disease, but that's really not the case. And your conclusion just now was that the case split does suggest protection from severe COVID-19 disease. But as stated in your briefing document, you just don't have enough data to know that. Well, it's been 26 days, and the question is, do we have such data? All we have, based upon what was the case 26 days ago, was actually a vaccine efficacy of 66% based on the actual endpoints, not the other data you talked about, which was from dose 1 and then you got to 88%. But the actual endpoint that was in the study and analyzed came up with a 66% vaccine efficacy, and that's concerning the thing that really matters to people. They care about severe disease. Frankly, almost nobody cares about COVID-19 at all. Does give you a sore throat. So I think it's really in the public's interest to know what is the story on this vaccine in preventing severe disease, and we really don't have sufficient data to conclude that as of November 14th. So can we get data? Is there data from Pfizer right now, as of yesterday, which shows additional cases that give us more data such that we can actually, they conclude in their document that the data does not meet prescribed success criteria, the endpoint of severe disease. Maybe their new data does. And then the second question is, if it's not sufficient yet, at what point do we project we might have sufficient data so we can really look at that critical question of whether this vaccine really prevents severe disease?
Could I ask the Pfizer team to respond about additional data?
It comes to the relevance. I like Dr. Gruber to respond to the first question in terms of additional data. And then also when it comes to severe disease, I would like to invite Dr. Stephen Thomas to give his perspective of the medical importance of preventing.
We really need to keep this. We need to keep it brief.
All right,
we don't
build up.
Okay, just
yeah. I can be fairly brief here.
Okay.
The answer to the question, as we heard earlier, it takes quite a bit of work to essentially prepare a data package for comprehensive review by the FDA. So since November the 14th, we obviously have not done the additional unblinded analysis. We will do that, obviously, at the direction of the FDA, and there is obviously the potential over time, at an appropriate time, in collaboration with the FDA, to look at that again. I can tell you that we don't have enough additional cases post the second dose to greatly enlarge that data, but I would emphasize that the data where we see the 1 to 9 split using the FDA guidance after the first dose and the 1 to 14 split, I think, in my view, and it seems to be in the FDA's view, is compelling for evidence of protection. I think it's just a matter of getting enough cases, and we have the potential to have more cases over time, but we've not analyzed them yet. Everything now.
Dr. Wollersheim, anything to add?
No, I agree. At some point, I guess we'll have those discussions in terms of when additional data will be requested, but that's not the topic for today's EUA discussion.
Okay, let's go on to Dr. Carrillo, please. No follow-up. We're pressed for time. I got 10 people who want to ask questions. Dr. Carrillo.
Yeah, I'd like one with the clinical findings of loss of smell and taste, which also involve cranial nerves. Is the Bell's palsy that odd in your mind that it could not be associated with some immunological response to the antigen? And the second is, in looking at the data package, we don't as yet have a recognized or accepted correlate of protection, and the panel of human convalescent plasma, if I recall, it was derived from 38 individuals, 35 of which had mild disease. Only one was hospitalized. I'm assuming the other 2 were asymptomatic. But we know that the antibody titers do scale with the severity of infection. So it seems like a little bit of a low bar to be comparing against people who had mild disease who may be the Pfizer group. The question I wanted to ask before is, you have crippled in terms of innate immune responses of the vaccine, but is that in general in of interferon responses and potentially natural killer responses from the vaccination and antigen non-independent response or an antigen non-specific response to the vaccination? Measuring the true efficacy of your adaptive immune response that you are clearly generating.
Dr. Wallersheim, please, and let.
And just given the small numbers of cases that we have, it would be difficult to attribute causation at this time. I do see your point with the symptomatology comparison of GMTs to the convalescent plasma panel, and I might actually ask Pfizer to address this question because I know that they had 2 different panels of convalescent plasma that they to those panels were. So I will actually let Pfizer address that question, please.
Yeah, I can, if it's okay, I can answer this. So it was a panel of 38 serums. And that 3 asymptomatic infection, 1 individual was hospitalized. And I just want to stress that we used that panel initially to give us guidance of how a vaccine-induced immune response compares to illusions in terms of a correlate of protection.
Okay, we're going to not worry about adaptive and innate immune responses right now. We'll take that offline. Dr. Perlman? Dr. Perlman, your question?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I just had a question about pregnant women. Because if an EUA is granted, I don't think there'll be pregnant women immunized. So the question is, when do you think we will?
I will defer that question here to Dr. Fink, who is here.
Hi. Thanks for asking that question. I'm trying to activate my video, but the
we know what you look like, Doran.
All right. So in the interest of time, right. So in the interest of time. You're correct that we have very limited data on use in pregnancy. We are expecting results of a developmental and reproductive toxicity study in animals to be submitted to us later this month. That type of data type of data typically precedes licensure of a vaccine. In terms of inclusion of pregnant women in the EUA, we recognize that among the groups first prioritized for vaccine use under EUA, there will be many women of childbearing potential, including women who are pregnant either knowingly or unknowingly. And we have really no data to speak to risks specific to the pregnant woman or the fetus, but also no data that would warrant a contraindication to use in pregnancy at this time. And so in the interest of allowing women of childbearing potential who would consider vaccination population, the population approved for use under EUA, they would be then free to make their own decision in conjunction with their healthcare provider.
Thank you.
Thank all the presenters and all the many, many people who contributed the work to the presentations. My question is for FDA, and it is about the 16 to 17-year-old group. I am concerned about the adolescent years. I appreciate that 16 and 17-year-olds are big and hairy to be down to the age of 16. Thanks.
Maybe I can address that question. So that's a decision that we would have to make at the time that we are considering a licensure application. Our regulations and laws do allow us to extrapolate effectiveness and safety from adult populations into pediatric populations. As you mentioned, the ages of 16 and 17 are those adolescents that are closest in age to adults, and so the extrapolation becomes biologically all that more reasonable. As well, the 16 and 17-year-olds are at increasing risk of exposure to SARS-CoV-2 because of the activities that they typically engage in. So as outlined in Dr. Wollersheim's presentation, for the purpose of this EUA, we do consider that safety and effectiveness from adults, in particular younger adults, could be extrapolated to older adolescents ages 16 and 17.
Thank you. The last question that we have time for right now, before we have a very short break, is from Dr. Rubin. Please.
Thank you for your careful analysis. It gets to one of the post hoc analyses you did. It looks as if 19 participants, regardless of their whether they were placebo or vaccine recipients, developed disease within the first 28 days. If you calculate that rate, you play with the numbers as much as we have them, that's a pretty high rate of infection. It's actually a little higher than the rate in the group that was allegedly not immune. And I wonder if that brings into question whether or not the anti-nucleocapsid antibody is actually a very good test, because there's a lot of independent evidence suggesting that people with anti-spike protein antibody are relatively protected. Since the entire evaluation of asymptomatic disease is going to depend on that, I wonder if the test is any good.
That's a good question, and at this point, those antibody tests have been qualified for that stage of development. It's not part of their final analysis at this point, so they've not been validated to a certain extent. So that would be something that we will be discussing further.
Right, and there's also the issue of seasonal coronaviruses.
Yeah,
When you
I would
get
give
into
Pfizer
that.
I would give Pfizer the opportunity to address the assays as well if they wish.
Pfizer representative, please, and we'll call. Then we're going to take a break.
Yes, sorry, I was on mute. Yes, so we have used the N protein assay to distinguish it from a vaccine-induced response, because we need to demonstrate prevention of asymptomatic infection, and we can't use the spike protein for this purpose because otherwise everyone would be positive that received the vaccine. The second question, I believe that you were asking, I'm blanking right now, was the second part of your question.
Well, it was whether it was really whether it was a good correlate of prior infection, the N protein.
Yes, so it is our understanding that N protein positivity does indeed develop within probably 2 weeks after becoming infected. There's of course another way to determining infection, which is by more frequent sampling using PCR. Both are I think valid approaches from our perspective. In terms of cross-reactivity with other seasonal coronavirus, that was very important for us to demonstrate it. So we have carefully looked at the N protein assay that we're using. It's a commercial test and have evaluated a relatively large number of sera that were collected prior to the appearance of SARS-CoV-2. And we have not seen any evidence of cross-reactivity to seasonal coronaviruses.
Okay, well, let us now take looking at the clock, a break until 10 minutes to 4, hard start, 10 minutes to 4. The meeting on October 22nd went on till 6:45 Eastern, and I don't think we want to go on that late tonight.
All right. With that, we're going to take a break. All right, welcome back, and we are now ready to start our committee discussion. So with that, Dr. Arnold, sorry, Dr. Monto, would you like to take it away?
Right. And I just, there we are. Could you put the discussion questions up, please, Mike?
Yep, I just did, sir.
All right. Don't see him yet.
It may take a moment as you just came in. Is it, just give it a moment, sir?
Okay, let me tell you, let me give you, let's discuss what we're going to do in the discussion, because I've had to cut off questions that were going to be given to the, or addressed to the presenters, the sponsor and FDA. What I would suggest, since we are running quite late, is that we have a discussion of these two items and ask the sponsor and FDA as we go through of any items of fact that they can help us in this discussion. So I don't need to read to you the discussion items. The item 1 is, please discuss Pfizer's plan, including how loss of blinded placebo-controlled follow-up in ongoing trials should be addressed. So we're talking here about plans for giving dose 3 and dose 4 as was shown in the last presentation, and also gaps in plans described today for further evaluation of vaccine safety and effectiveness. So I think they're related, and I think we need to continue our discussion around both of these points, plus any other specific questions you have of the sponsors or FDA. I think we want to stay away from more discussions about immune response and other things that could be taken offline. So with that introduction, Dr. Gans.
I had a question regarding the unblinding. So, you know, if we go through with the EUA as number 1, the actual unblinding in any manner, so if we did the crossover, how is that actually going to affect the BLA? Because all of the data that was presented today on how they would move forward on the BLA is assuming that there isn't an unblinding, and so the data that they think would support that. I think that would be important for us to understand the impact of having an EUA. And my second question, because I think we have still a lot of conversation.
You're breaking up. Is
oh, sorry.
Are other people able to hear?
Now she is breaking up a little bit, Dr. Gans.
Sorry about that. Is this better? Hello?
Go ahead, continue.
Okay. The second question is, we have a lot of questions about the use of the vaccine, and as we've heard, asymptomatic, continued ability to, asymptomatic carriage, and therefore being contagious to those around us. And it would be very important to understand, even if they had any data from household contacts, in terms of how, of people who are already vaccinated, what the rates of disease were in those situations.
Let's keep the second part of your question, which we had problems hearing anyway, to the discussion before we get to the voting question, because we're going to want to have a second round of discussions before we get to the voting question. So is there anybody from FDA who wants to address the issue of how the unblinding issue could affect the BLA?
Anyone? Dr. Gruber? Dr. Gruber, let's just make sure that we unmute you. There we go.
I know it took me a minute. I just wanted to say that starting with a general comment that, of course, the gold standard for doing phase 3 studies to demonstrate the safety and the efficacy of a product is by a randomized controlled trial, ideally the placebo-controlled study. And this is why, from a regulatory perspective, of course, we would welcome continuing the placebo-controlled follow-up for as long as feasible, recognizing the complexities thereof, and that was, I think, very nicely discussed by Dr. Goodman this morning. So we would, of course, be looking at potentially losing longer-term safety follow-up, but realizing the gravity, of course, of the pandemic, and if we're really looking at having to think about other designs and modification of the protocol, we would be looking at that and to see and make sure that we have sufficient data regarding safety. I'm not that worried about effectiveness, but regarding safety then to support a BLA application. So I think, if it's no longer feasible to really keep the blind, to really get those data from a placebo-controlled efficacy study, we would, of course, look at other approaches to get these data. And I'll stop it here, and I think perhaps Dr. Fink wants to add to that. Thank you.
I actually don't have much to add. I was trying to jump in, and the platform wasn't letting me. It seems to be a delay, so nothing else.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Fuller, and let's try to keep to one-part questions until we catch up at least. Dr. Fuller.
Yes. Yes, thank you. This is a simple question. Risk assessment is going to be very critical for uptake of the community. Was the placebo including the LNP, or did it only have other material? So in other words, are the side effects that we've seen in the limited amount of risk assessment that's been done in 2 months due to only the spike protein because the placebo has the lipid material, or is that due to both the lipid and the spike protein expression, and we don't know what the lipid does alone? This will be really critical considering that most of the people who are getting vaccinated have not yet seen multiple exposures to the coronavirus. So what does that mean for long-term effects that cannot even be looked at right now because we just got this into people?
Okay, I don't know who wants to take that. Dr. Krause.
So just to answer quickly, the placebo control was a saline control. So the vaccine is being compared against a complete placebo, not against the lipid. So the side effects that were observed are due to the combination of the lipid and the
Okay.
So we have no idea what putting a messenger RNA lipid vaccine into people does long term. It's not been done before. And we're going from 20,000 people who get this vaccine to millions who get this vaccine with a very limited amount of risk assessment. Is that correct?
Dr. Krause?
I apologize. I'd accidentally muted you when I was trying to get off here, and so I did not hear that question.
We will be looking at, yes. We have very little information about what happens to people who get the vaccine and then subsequently get exposed to COVID-19. because we've only looked for 2 months, and that didn't include, it included the vaccine with the lipid and the messenger RNA. So we don't even know what's going to happen long term to people who get these lipid particles plus the vaccine. There's such a limited risk assessment that I think the uptake in the community is going to be fairly poor unless something better is done.
Pfizer may comment, but there has been a number of other vaccines that have been mRNA vaccines that have been studied where people have gotten these lipids and have been followed for considerably longer periods of time, although not the very large numbers of people that you might be looking for here. But perhaps we can give Pfizer an opportunity to comment on that.
And also we know that COVID-19 is a multi-organ disease, so it's not like some of the previous lipid vaccines. This is something we don't know very much about, the pathology of this coronavirus.
Dr. Townsend? And then we'll move on, please. I think you're muted.
We actually have evaluated what happens after when individuals are being exposed by COVID-19 in our studies. So while we have relatively few cases of individuals that had breakthrough infections with COVID-19, nevertheless, those individuals showed, as we saw, a much lower profile of severity compared to the many of the 162 individuals that received placebo. The other point I would make is that we have stated multiple times that we will follow our trial participants up to the end of the study, which is planned to last for the full duration of 24 months.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Offit.
Okay, thanks. So my question is for Bill Gruber from Pfizer. I'm worried about the severe anaphylactic reactions for this reason. We don't know the details of those 2 cases. We don't know specifically what it was they were allergic to or what their history with severe allergies was. We just know that they carried EpiPens. The public health people in the UK said if you have a history of severe allergies, you can't get this vaccine. Similarly, Monsef Slaoui here, head of Warp Speed, said the same thing. If you have a history of severe allergies, you can't get this vaccine. There are tens of millions of people in this country who carry EpiPens with them because they have peanut allergies, because they have egg allergies, who are going to believe now that they can't get this vaccine. That's a lot of people. So what I would suggest is, first we need to drill down on those 2 people that in the UK, but I think more importantly, Dr. Gruber, you had said that that there were no cases of severe allergy in your trial. Did you exclude people with a history of severe allergy? That's question 1.
He addressed question 1, and then I think maybe what I'll do, Dr. Offit, is defer to our head of safety at Pfizer, who can describe more about what we know about the cases that occurred in the UK, and then the nature of our plans for moving forward, and perhaps we can even include the regulatory view. So the nature of what was actually excluded from the trial was really restricted to those individuals who had a severe allergic reaction to a vaccine, any vaccine previously, or if obviously during the course of the trial they'd gotten the first dose and they had a significant type 1 hypersensitivity response, then that would preclude giving a second dose. And we did not encounter that circumstance in the trial. The first circumstance, I don't know how many people we actually screened out who had a prior issue with having had an anaphylactic reaction to a vaccine, but we didn't have to exclude anybody from getting the second dose. So as I said, at least during the course of the trial, we had not seen anything that alerted us to a safety signal associated with the vaccine or the potential for anaphylaxis. But maybe what I can do is, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So Bill, what I'm asking is this, do you know whether there were people in the trial who were in the vaccine group who had a history of severe anaphylaxis, period, not necessarily to a vaccine, or if they had a history of carrying an EpiPen? Do you have those data?
Yeah, let me ask Dr. Cabell to share with you what we do know in terms of the nature of pre-existing allergic conditions and the outcomes in the trial. To my knowledge, we didn't have anybody that had a prior history of anaphylaxis, but let me ask Dr. Cabell to actually share with you the information that we do have.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Patrick Cobert. I'm the head of safety for Pfizer and also the chief safety officer for Pfizer. Actually, we know more about these two cases that occurred in the UK. So let me give you more detail about these two cases. So these two cases, in fact, were reported in the UK on December 8th, so which means, the first day of the vaccination campaign in the UK. So the same day, 6,000 people were vaccinated in the US, and all these vaccinations were performed, as in hospital settings, because the primary target for the vaccination in the UK are healthcare provider. In fact, it happened that these two subjects were not only they were, as I said, care workers. They were 49 and 40-year-old. The first subject, in fact, had a medical history of severe allergic reaction. So he had a severe allergic reaction, which with anaphylaxis, but not following drugs. He had, in fact, a food allergy. He was allergic to eggs and to cheesecake and lemon and lice. But in fact, the last episode of the cheesecake led her to the emergency room, where she needed to have resuscitation and administration of epinephrine. So in fact, for this first patient, the case of anaphylaxis occurred only a few minutes after the vaccination. She required intravenous administration of epinephrine, corticosteroids, and finally the patient fully recovered. The second patient, in fact, was little bit milder, but it was a patient which also had a medical history of allergy to drugs. We don't know which drugs yet, but she was under the care of an immunologist when before receiving the vaccination. So it was mostly, in this case, shortness of breath, tachycardia, and finally she required also the administration of epinephrine. Again, these two cases occurred the first day of vaccination. Actually, we had also a third case that was reported the second day of vaccination, which was not really a case of anaphylaxis. It was just a patient who developed supraventricular tachycardia. She had some skin redness. She was given hydrocortisone and antihistamines, and finally, and then she went back into a sinusal mode, and finally also fully recovered. At this stage, we don't think that this third case is case of immunoallergy. So, in fact,
okay. Can I ask Dr. Gruber how FDA is going to respond to these reports?
I cannot. Do you want to answer? Or
I think you were speaking of Marion Gruber. I think this is the FDA.
I think, Doctor, I was speaking of Marion Gruber. Excuse me.
Yeah. Okay. And I just also wanted to say, I am not aware that we are related, Bill. So we had that discussion before. So, yeah. So first of all, we have been in communication with the Medical Health and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, in the United Kingdom, who made us aware of these two cases of anaphylactic reactions. And what was just reported about what is known about these was also transmitted to us. At this point, we are seeking further information from the MHRA under our confidentiality agreements to learn more about this and to really tease that out. I also wanted to to remind the committee, and I think Dr. Wollersheim really presented that nicely, of the safety analysis that the FDA independently conducted by doing standard MEDVA queries, and we looked at events that could potentially include or present allergic reactions. We found a slight numerical imbalance there that Susan reported and presented on. I want to stress that none of these were considered to be serious, none of them received epinephrine injection, and none of these events occurred in the immediate post-vaccination period. That being said, over the last couple of weeks, we have been working with Pfizer on generating fact sheets and prescribing information, and we, FDA and the sponsor, we agreed for the fact sheets and the prescribing information for this vaccine to include information under contraindication and under warning. So the fact sheets and the prescribing information will state that this vaccine should not be administered to individuals with known history of severe allergic reactions to any components of the Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine, and the warning statement will say appropriate medical treatment used to manage immediate allergic reactions must be immediately available in the event an acute anaphylactic reaction occurs following administration of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. So that has made it already in these fact sheets and prescribing information weeks ago. We, however, will consider any additional information that we're going to be receiving over the next couple of days and factoring this into our decision making to decide whether the fact sheets and the prescribing information may need to be further revised to include additional precautionary statements. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Mary, can I just offer one thing and then I'll stop? If you look at the components of that vaccine, which has probably the longest chemical name of any vaccine I've ever seen in terms of that lipid moiety, nobody's going to look at that name and think, you know, I'm allergic to that. So here's what I would suggest moving forward, just as a practical solution. I think a study should be done by Pfizer, whomever, where you take people who have a known history of severe egg allergy, a known history of severe peanut allergy, and give them these vaccines under careful observation to prove that this is not going to be a problem for them, because you're talking about tens of millions of people who are going to not get this vaccine because of the comments that were made both by the UK and both by Moncef Slaoui here. I just think it's a practical solution because this is not going to die. This issue is not going to die until we have better data.
Okay, let's...
Okay.
Mariam, do you have any ads?
Yeah.
And then we'll go to Dr. Meisner.
Just a short response to that. I mean, I hear your suggestion, Paul, and I think so did Pfizer. We, however, need to decide on the issuance of an EUA the next couple of weeks or days more than weeks. And we are looking at the question whether the benefits outweigh the risks. You know,
I agree. The benefits I'm fine with
not
I'm just
determine if this product is safe and effective for the purpose of licensing it. I just wanted to remind you. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to Dr. Meisner.
The current discussion.
You're muted. Okay.
First of all, in terms of the current discussion of anaphylaxis, remember that's recommended for any vaccine that's administered. The vaccinator should be able to handle anaphylactic reaction from any vaccine. It wouldn't be just for a COVID-19 vaccine, number one. And Paul, I'm not sure that an allergic reaction to ovalbumin would have much bearing on the risk of a reaction to this vaccine. Number two, going back to the pregnancy discussion, my concern is that during pregnancy there's a great deal of replication, of DNA replication, cellular replication that's occurring in the fetus. And vaccinating a pregnant woman with this messenger RNA gives me a little bit of pause. We certainly, and I understand the response, but could there be a retrovirus somehow around a migrant retrovirus and reverse transcribe this RNA into the chromosome of the baby. That is one thought. The next point, I agree very much with Dr. Mark Sawyers and his comment about a 16 and 17-year-olds. There are only 163 subjects who have been enrolled in the randomized trial, and we have heard that the inflammatory response is higher in younger people than it is in the elderly. I think we need more information before we think about that. And then the final point I want to make, and thank you for your patience, back to Dr. Gans. It's so important. An EUA, we need this vaccine. We need to do our very best to develop herd immunity. We need this vaccine. But we need to move it from an EUA to a BLA as soon as it satisfies the threshold that the FDA will hold this vaccine to. But there are many reasons to move it to a BLA, such as it will be included in the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program if the CDC recommends it for adults and for children. So I think we need to move in that direction. Thank you.
Cody, I just want to say one thing. I'm not talking, I completely agree with you that I don't think...
Very quickly.
Okay, quickly. I just think that I'm talking about perception more than reality. With those two statements out there, the people who have severe allergic reaction shouldn't get this vaccine. I think we just need to offer people some solace that this is not going to be a problem for them. I'm not saying this should stop us moving forward at all with approving this vaccine. I'm just saying when it rolls out there, this is going to be an issue, and we need to have some data that we arm ourselves with so we can address it. That's all. I'm not saying it's biologically sound. I'm just saying that we need data to argue against it any more than, vaccines cause autism was biologically sound. We just need data to address it. That's all I'm saying.
I agree.
Thank you. I think we agree perception is everything. Facts may be important, but perception drives a lot of decisions. Dr. Annunziato.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Bill Gruber. Bill, in your study, can you describe for us how the non-solicited adverse experiences that were collected up until 1 month after dose 2 were collected? In other words, was there active surveillance for those events as well? And then for your plans for under an EUA, if a subject is unblinded and vaccinated, could you also just reiterate for us what safety surveillance you will be conducting in that situation?
Yes, thanks, Paula. I may call upon Nick Kitchen to help with some of the details. He's the clinical lead for the program. But the e-diary information was solicited and collected for the first 7 days, and then investigators were encouraged to essentially collect adverse events, but in an unsolicited fashion for the first month after administration. And then, I'm sorry, the second question was what again?
What are the plans for safety collection for the subjects who may opt to be unblinded and then vaccinated after the EUA is issued?
Right. So I'm going to defer to Dr. Kitchen, who's helped put together our latest amendment that deals with management of the placebo recipients, to perhaps address both questions, but particularly the second one. Dr. Kitchen.
Thank you, Bill. This is Nick Kitchen from Pfizer. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, yes. So with respect to elicitation of adverse events, and specifically the reactogenicity type events that you were asking about for subjects that were not in the subset, they were elicited in the same way as other adverse events. There weren't specific leading or directed questions to elicit specifically for those events, and that's why you would, typically would expect to see them seeing at a lower rate when reported as adverse events rather than when as actively solicited daily for 7 days immediately after vaccination in the diary.
So for reactogenicity, the data from the subset gives us the best picture of the profile. With respect to our plans for safety surveillance for subjects that would be receiving the BNT162b2 as a result of being eligible, for example, under EUA, our intention is to use the same safety surveillance as those not in the subset. So we would not use e-diaries for those subjects that were moving across, but they would have all adverse events elicited for 1 month after what would be their 4th vaccination, but their 2nd active dose, and 6 months for serious adverse.
Now, I might just add, Paul, as you can well recognize, 8,000 subjects set for common events that are being solicited routinely, like fever, headache, fatigue, the chills. We probably have, in fact, I would argue we do have sufficient precision on those common sorts of events. So it makes less sense, I think, to essentially say, you come back and you also now have to essentially do the e-diaries again. I don't think it really will add value, and it potentially could mitigate against individuals wanting to participate.
Sure. Thank you.
Dr. Lee.
So my question is really for Pfizer about their blinded follow-up or unblinding the placebo recipients. And I think one question I have is why in your unblinding is there not incorporated some sort of scale or whatever you want to call it for severity grade or risk factor, either based on age, comorbidity, or so forth. Instead, you're relying on local and national guidelines, and I can tell you they're going to vary state by state, county by county here, and you're going to have a hodgepodge. So it seems if you were going to incorporate something about the risk factors, you might have a little bit more consistency on the follow-up of various risk groups, and I didn't know if Pfizer had considered that at all.
Glad you asked maybe that question because it moves us back to the discussion topics. Can we have Pfizer responding, please?
Yes, could I please ask Dr. Ann Madsen to explain in detail how we are going to follow vaccine recipients over time? No, it wasn't a question. It wasn't a question of follow-up. It was a question of identifying when somebody would be eligible to be unblinded that would include their risk factors, not just local and national criteria, because they will vary tremendously in this country and I suspect elsewhere. Okay, and maybe Dr. Gruber, please.
Yeah. And I may call upon Nick to help with this too. We obviously, as you heard this morning from Dr. Goodman, this is an incredibly challenging area for us to, put forward the right path. We want to be conscientious about providing vaccine to individuals that would qualify. So the onus is on us to take the EU, the emergency use authorization and the recommendations to heart. If you happen to live in an area where, in fact, you are eligible, we'd be hard-pressed to say, well, because we've taken a national recommendation, you don't fit because we're just going by the national recommendations. I think we have yet to see how that will work in practice, but it is our intent to try to do what we think is right to follow the guidance and local recommendations. We're also obviously facing this, as you can perceive, not just on a national level, but internationally, since we have a number of countries involved. So we have to look at each of those issues and weigh them to make that type of decision. I don't know, Nick, if you have anything else to add to that.
I know that you will be in discussion, Bill, with FDA about these. Well,
right. I mean, that's clearly a part and parcel of why I'm glad this is a topic for discussion.
Exactly.
Yeah, Bill. Sorry, Bill. Yeah, this is Nick Kitchen again from Pfizer. Just to add, so yes, our intention, at least initially, we would anticipate in terms of the recommendations following the initial ACIP recommendations. So we will provide specific guidance, more specific than applying to local and national recommendations. But certainly to start with, I imagine it would follow how ACIP would recommend allocation of the doses.
Thank you. And as we go forward, please mainly pay attention to the discussion items because, as many have stated, we'd like to move to a BLA submission promptly, or as smoothly, I won't say promptly, as smoothly as possible. And the answer to some of these issues is going to affect that. So, Dr. Moore.
Hi, yes. One question that addresses these two discussion items that I find is really, really central and important is that FDA did not ask in its guidance, and Pfizer has presented no evidence in its data today that the vaccine has any effect on virus carriage or shedding, which is the fundamental basis for herd immunity. And so even though the individual efficacy of this vaccine is very, very, very high, we really, as of right now, do not have any evidence that it will have an impact on social-wide on the epidemic. And so I would like to ask before the unblinding that Pfizer seriously consider performing nucleic acid assays on the vaccinees and the placebo patients. I don't know whether the point estimate for shedding is going to be high enough that you're going to see a significant difference. But at least one should try because that's the one piece of data that we're going to completely lose once the unblinding occurs.
Let me just interrupt and tell you that these questions are being addressed by CDC in the observational studies as we go forward because of sample size issues and a lot of issues that are not possible when you're not looking at households where transmission will take place.
Right. In my discussions with the CDC, they certainly would like to have a toe-in to the vaccine companies to be able to help perform these very types of studies if at all possible. And so that industry CDC collaboration would be tremendous, but it is so important as of right now as to whether or not this vaccine can have an impact on non-vaccinated persons who are at risk for acquiring infection. We don't know that.
Dr. Jansen, you want to comment?
Yes, we actually are looking into this to do precisely that, not just to look for a prevention of asymptomatic infection, but also doing the PCR testing to look for virus acquisition or prevention of virus acquisition. I may remind, though, that we have data, not from humans, but from our non-human primate study, that would argue that the vaccine does prevent infection. We have seen that it prevents infection of the lung, and we actually have also seen some evidence that it has a more transient, that virus is more transiently detected in the vaccinated animals compared to the control animals.
Yes, but in humans,
okay, we're going to have to move. We're going to have to move on. Dr. Kim.
I think this relates to discussion item number 2. Vaccine efficacy data might not be evident for the for HIV-positive study participants given their small number, but presumably preliminary vaccine safety data are available. After all, trial participants were enrolled in October, and EUA application was made on November 20th. Would Pfizer please comment? Meaning, are there any updated information since people with HIV infection
or other conditions that are stable and meet the criteria for vaccination will be standing in line for the vaccine in short time.
Bill, could you please comment?
Yes. So obviously, we included individuals, as I mentioned and Dr. Jansen mentioned, with HIV, HCV, and HBV if they had stable infection. And we've obviously included additional evaluations of that group beyond the core group that we're looking for solicited, unsolicited adverse events. So, within the population that we have so far, we have within the 38K database about 120 of these and 196 in the total 43,000 plus database. So we're getting to a point where we will have enough of those individuals to look at, and we would propose, obviously, doing that in association with the filing that goes into the BLA, if not sooner. We just need to have enough of them. As you may know, we amended the protocol in flight, so there was a little bit of delay. That was really the only population apart from the 12 to 15-year-olds and that were a little bit delayed in terms of enrollment in the trial because of the way that was staggered. But yes, it is our intent to essentially have more information on that population.
Okay, Dr. Pergam.
Thanks. So I had a question about, since this vaccine is going to be rolled out through the EUA, there's going to be a fair number of people who might have access to the vaccine who've had previous COVID exposure, may not know they've been positive, or have known history of positivity. There's limited data in the trial, at least, because of enrollment for people that are previously positive. So the two questions kind of relating to both of these questions is, thinking about potentially looking at side effects within the group that potentially gets this. Is there an increased enhancement of the side effects? Didn't look like it in the initial data you showed, but looking at that a little more carefully in people that have known prior positivity. And then secondarily, I'm curious, what are you going to do with patients in the clinical trial who did develop COVID? Are they going to also be offered the vaccine? Just as a question for Pfizer.
Jansen, I think you're muted.
Not exactly an advertisement for Adobe Connect.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you, Catherine.
Yeah, so I think we may have lost the link.
No, we can hear you.
Oh, you know? Okay. Oh, good. Okay, thank you. Yeah. I would like to take the first part of the question and then have Dr. Gruber comment on the second one. So while we have excluded individuals with known COVID-19, so meaning PCR confirmed COVID-19, we actually do have in our trial individuals that are seropositive. In other words, they were prior exposed to COVID-19. And so our estimate is about 2 to 3% of the individuals that were participating in our trials were seropositive at baseline. Bill, if you want to take the second.
Yeah, so I think the second question was about the nature of the safety profile in individuals that had evidence of prior SARS coronavirus infection or were PCR positive at the time they appeared for their first or second dose. And the bottom line is, and this has been submitted to the FDA, if you just separate out that group, and again, it's a small proportion of the total population, but still fairly sizable when you look at the total group. We had, I guess, well over 150, I think, in the reactogenicity subset and over 500 in the larger database of looking at unsolicited adverse events. And when you compare that to the individuals that had no prior evidence of infection, it looks basically the same. I mean, point estimates actually look a little bit better, but obviously within the realm of statistical significance, we can't make much of that. But clearly, these individuals did not fare worse from the vaccine. And I think we've not seen anything in terms of, as those individuals have tracked through the study, a particularly high attack rate or severe disease that would suggest to us that there's a problem in that group.
Okay, Dr. Kurilla. One part only.
Thank you. If Pfizer were to receive an EUA and you lost all of the participants in the trial who were healthcare workers, would the remainder still allow you to have be adequately powered to carry on? That would be my first question. The other is...
I said one part only.
Well, I'm just going to put my hand up again then.
Well, then you'll go to the bottom of the queue. Okay,
okay. Well,
please, that's an important question.
So I would like to have Bill address this, and then we may also need help from Dr. Ken Curry.
Yeah, so thanks, Catherine. So I think it's our current estimate, as best we can determine, that about maybe 20% or something north of that may fit into the health provider category. However, that still leaves, of course, 80%. Given the high attack rate, presuming that those placebo recipients remained in the trial for a while longer, we know that we would be in a good position, particularly sadly given the high attack rate, that we could still track out and get a good measure both for safety and efficacy over the longer term. I think the bigger challenge really relates to how quickly the CDC moves forward to the additional tiers and how quickly those populations again get encompassed within emergency use authorization and to be covered if we conform to the plan that we've outlined. But it's my sense, and I'll ask Ken Curry, who's our head of stats, just to comment on this, but it's my sense that yes, even with 20% loss, we won't have that much difficulty. If we were sort of in the 50 to 60% efficacy category, that could potentially prove more challenging. I don't know, Dr. Curry.
Yeah, hi, this is Ken Corey. I lead the vaccine statistics Pfizer, and those answers are correct. The study is well positioned to continue to accrue more cases and to be able to answer some of these questions with more precision.
Thank you, Dr. Hildreth. And please, let's keep it mainly to the discussion items.
Thank you, Dr. Monto. My question is for Pfizer, and it relates to the recruitment of minorities into the study, which is relevant to number 2. My understanding is that the minorities were recruited fairly late in the process. So do we have an adequate follow-up to that group compared to the majority of the participants? The 2-month median is what I'm referring to. Can someone address that for me? Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to, Dr. Gruber to comment on the demographics.
Thanks, Catherine. Let me correct one perhaps incorrect assumption, which is that we actually from the very start were focused on targeting in recruitment from racial and ethnic minorities. But what we decided to do after we proved successful in terms of the overall success in getting to 30,000 and then deciding how to move forward, we decided at that point, given that we'd had some success, but we wanted to have more, we actually informed sites that to preferentially, beyond what they'd already done, any new recruitment that they provided was really targeted to minority communities. So it was a fact that we started from the very beginning, but then we further enriched at the end. So I would say you could feel confident that minority communities were recruited throughout, perhaps with a bit more towards the end. But I'm convinced, and I think the data supports, that we had individuals for those communities followed for a long enough time, certainly to demonstrate efficacy, within the limits, of course, of some of the groups having a smaller number of total cases. But it's not the right assumption that we didn't start from the very beginning. That was a key ingredient we advertised, both on our websites and everywhere else that we could, about our intent to bring people of color into the trial.
Okay, Dr. Levy, on the discussion items, please.
Hi. My webcam isn't working. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We don't need to see you.
Okay, fair enough. So my question is in terms of gaps. This is a very big picture question. If we want to have a safe and effective vaccine deployed and make a huge dent in this pandemic, eventually what will be needed is high vaccine penetrance, right? 60, 70, 80% of the vulnerable population immunized. Would we realistically get there, given the structure of the United States and the tendency of adults in the United States? Would we realistically get there without a pediatric vaccine? And I realize there are all sorts of challenges and hurdles and counter arguments, but I'd be interested to hear from FDA and Pfizer if they've given long-term thought to the ultimate end game here, because if there were a safe and effective pediatric vaccine, obviously the infrastructure for vaccine delivery and penetration of vaccine is very favorable in that regard. Thank you.
Let's keep the answers relatively short. That's a very big question. So Pfizer pediatric plans?
Bill, you want to take that?
Sure, I'm happy to. We obviously recognize the importance of moving into the pediatric population, and I touched base on this briefly in the main presentation. We thought so strongly about this that, as you know, we obviously are trying to seek an indication in 16 to 17-year-olds, which we think is supported by what you've heard from us and the FDA. In addition to which, we already have 12 to 15-year-olds in the trial, which not only inform the ability to move forward in that group, where we're going to recruit 2,000 individuals, but actually also the preliminary information which we submitted to the FDA from the first 100 individuals looks quite good compared to the reactogenicity we're seeing in 18 to 25 and 18 to 55-year-olds. So we're already embarking on that path, and then it's our intention, if all continues to go well, and so far it has from a safety point of view, to move down to 5 to 11-year-olds based on the nature of the data becoming available, the completion of where we are with the 12 to 15-year-olds. We anticipate that will commence by April of 2020. And the idea would be to start there, and then, as is typical for pediatric trials, once we have documented safety in that group, move down. It's our expectation, although I'm encouraged that it might not necessarily be the case, that we may need to do dose ranging in the 5 to 11-year-olds. We thought that might happen in the 12 to 15, but they seem to tolerate the 30 microgram well. But once we move down to 5 to 11, we'll be very judicious, just as we were in the 12 to 15, doing a small sample of sentinels and then working our way down. And then ultimately, we propose to move down in younger age groups below 5 years of age. And again, we do that in a judicious fashion.
Dr. Krause.
Additional comment, if I can, on behalf of FDA, and that is that the Pediatric Research Equity Act actually requires there to be a plan for evaluating products in pediatric patients and in children. But of course, there's also a requirement that you can't do research in children unless you have a prospect of benefit. And so you can't do these studies initially in children, but I think moving quickly now that benefit of the vaccine has been established is a very reasonable thing to do. That's something that we'll be working with the sponsor on. I'm wondering, while I have the floor though, that I might drive things back towards the actual discussion items a little bit more directly.
Thank you.
And in that regard, we heard this morning from Dr. Goodman suggestion that we might look towards, instead of an unblinding, when people become eligible for receipt of a vaccine outside of a trial, a crossover design in which blinding is maintained. And of course, if one is to do something like that, that then is the last opportunity in which one might be able to draw a serum on people in the trial in order to determine whether they've seroconverted, which would then give a chance to look at the question raised earlier as to whether or not people have gotten infected while one still can compare a vaccine versus placebo. So I don't know if anyone at Pfizer is prepared to opine on this, but do these seem like reasonable things for you to do, to, instead of unblinding, to do a crossover when people become eligible for a vaccine, but also to draw serum on these individuals before that happens, to allow for this kind of additional look at the last moment before the placebos then, in essence, disappear, and one then loses that opportunity to compare, you know, also in the blood, what happened to vaccinees versus placebo recipients.
I can take that first question and comment. So we are fully planning to actually do the analysis of vaccine protection against asymptomatic infection very soon, as I noted, probably the beginning of or in very early in 2021. And so we can take under advisement to see if there is an opportunity or value based on our routine serum sample that we do in the participants anyway. Even additional blood draw would be of value. And then for the blinding question that you have, I would also give it back to Dr. Gruber to comment.
Yes, thanks, Catherine. Obviously, the considerations that were discussed by Dr. Goodman have been front and center for us in thinking about how we would move forward. We have looked at the issue of a potential crossover, and although there is some potential advantage, I think some things that are being advertised may be sort of a false premise. Once, for instance, individuals know that they've received vaccine in both groups, you sort of, have essentially, equalize them in terms of their perception about whether they need to come in for illness visits or not. So that's a challenge. Deferral, in the circumstances is not an option for ACIP recommended groups. So that's a challenge in terms of obviously solving for our ethical obligations to vaccinate folks. There's also the logistic approach. As I mentioned, when we're enrolling 22,000 individuals, somebody has to be first in line. We can't bring them all in, on day one. So the idea was, okay, with the EUA authorization, we can kind of bring them in as that authorization and recommendation expands. On the other hand, if you're talking about a crossover where everybody is now going to have to come in for 2 additional visits, you're talking
Well, it
now
would be
about
twice as many people, but of course, I think that what he proposed was you also only bring them in for crossover as they otherwise become eligible.
44,000 individuals would have to be brought in for 2 additional visits, and those individuals that are receiving vaccine would have to do this, in essence, be reconsented, essentially agree to come back for 2 additional visits. Now, I heard, Dr. Goodman appropriately saying that some of these people, and we would hope that this would be the case if you chose that path, would do this out of the goodness of their heart. But it does mean that they have to come back for an otherwise unintended or a visit back to a medical facility, and the risk of exposure just from that sort of experience in and of itself. So the notion of what we're concerned about is that when we add this additional piece of work that these individuals have to not only agree to, but provide informed consent for 2 additional visits, for those for both groups, that creates, potentially from their perspective, maybe the risk-benefit equation isn't such a great idea for me. I'm going to just go ahead and wait and my turn and get the vaccine. So I think those are things that the logistics are something that are not trivial, because we've got to bring in basically a lot of people to be vaccinated. And if we now add this to 88,000 visits, that's a challenge. Obviously, we enrolled 44,000 people and done 88,000 visits, but it took us a number of months to do that. And so if the notion is trying to strike the right balance between getting people timely vaccination when they're eligible, there are some advantages to be gained by just having to vaccinate the placebo recipient.
Of course, one of the questions in the way this is being put to the committee is that if you can't do this and you then lose the ability, for instance, to look more directly at duration of efficacy, and already even in the crossover design, lose the ability to do, in many people, longer-term follow-up for safety. And of course, as it is the people who are at highest risk, who are those who are also going to be suggested for earliest vaccination, and so you'll then lose the ability in continuing your trial to look at further impact on severe disease. What are the ways in which the inability to get that information from continued follow-up in the trial will be addressed? How can the American people, as well as the FDA and the CDC recommending bodies, be sure that we have enough information to proceed with the vaccine and understand exactly what the longer-term safety, durability, and efficacy against severe disease is?
I mean, those are all reasonable questions and ones that we're wrestling with. But I think we've already sort of addressed the common reactogenicity. I don't think there's likelihood that you'll get much more precision related to that. So if you set that aside, there is this period of time where we would expect we would continue to be able to collect information as the EUA rolls out in those individuals that remain. As I said, maybe 20% of the population would be vaccinated. It will still take some time to do that. So, imagine we might be able to do that within 1 or 2 months. That's still, even within that population, a time where we would be continuing to collect cases. As far as safety is concerned, the same thing applies. You still would have a proportion of these individuals for looking for longer-term events. As we move farther and farther out, the likelihood that you've got a vaccine-related event, I think, becomes diminishingly small. Part of the reason, I think we were enamored with the idea of a median follow-up of 2 months is our perspective that if you're going to see something specifically related to vaccine, it's more likely to happen in that time span, and you've already got a significant database to look at that. So, it's my sense, and of course you don't lose the ability to look at efficacy over the long period of time. Let's suppose that all the placebo recipients ended up moving over to the trial relatively quickly. One of the key features is looking at durability of response, and you can look comparatively at the newly vaccinated. I think we heard this from Dr. Goodman this morning. You can look comparatively at the newly vaccinated compared to the previously vaccinated and determine whether or not you're beginning to see those individuals that previous vaccinees, that their curve, basically starts sloping up, and it becomes, suggesting that you're losing protection. So, based on...
Although that analysis was based on a premise of blinded follow-up.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last comment.
I think the analysis was put forward by Dr. Folman of the NIH was based on a premise of blinded follow-up, not of unblinded follow-up.
But I'm talking about a circumstance where you would just be able to compare the attack rates in the respective groups based on the difference in terms of timing as far as vaccine. Of course, that's predicated on what's happening with the pandemic. I'd like nothing better than the pandemic has gone away. We did that, but I think based on what I'm hearing from the experts, some of whom we heard from today, it's our expectation over the span of time we would plan to conduct this, that we would badly be in a position where we would likely be able to determine if, in fact, those attack rates for those people that were more remotely vaccinated went up.
Okay. Going to have 2 more questions, and then we are going to move into discussion of our voting. question. So Dr. Chatterjee and then Dr. Cohen.
Thank you, Dr. Monto. I'd like to address discussion item number 2. Dr. Gruber, in your presentation, slide number CC58, I believe, you spoke about different studies that Pfizer might be conducting, but I did not see long-term care facility residents listed. They are obviously at high risk, because of which they're being prioritized to receive the vaccine. And the other one was inclusion of any concomitant use trials, particularly with influenza vaccines. At least in the Northern Hemisphere, this vaccine will be rolled out at a time when influenza vaccines are also being given. So does the sponsor have studies planned for those two populations, or those two types of?
So Catherine, do you want me to go ahead and take that?
So yeah, it was addressed to you, Bill.
Okay. So let me address the second question first. I think it was on the slide. We do have a plan to potentially look at concomitant influenza vaccines, recognizing just the issue that you raised. It would be great if we find that this vaccine manages to provide protections that's durable and no one requires an additional dose. And as we said, we're going to be looking very intently at the durability of protection. But if that's not the case, and the presumption is that over the course of the coming months we'll begin to get a clue about that, then we would be considering looking at co-administration of influenza vaccine, assuming that that would be a timely period for annual vaccination if protection was not conferred. I think that the challenge that we encountered, and we thought seriously about the long-term care facilities for a prospective trial, given the nature of the closed nature of that, getting the informed consent, a lot of logistic issues. And I think this isn't unique to us. I think it's common to a number of the other sponsors, except maybe the monoclonal antibody trials. That didn't prove to be fertile ground for us to be able to move forward to get a good answer. I think we can take some comfort. In fact, I'd say a great deal of comfort when we look at the older populations that are engaged in our trial, where we're showing efficacy, particularly not only in people that are older, but people older with comorbid conditions like obesity and the Charlson comorbidity conditions that I think would translate well into a high likelihood of protecting against individuals in long-term care facilities. I might defer to Dr. Louis Jodar, who I know he and his team have thought about more long-term follow-up in terms of the nature of surveillance, and I'm sure the CDC and others will be looking at those populations as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Gruber. I'm
very brief, please.
Chief Medical Officer for vaccines. I do not have much to add, but as to say that as we plan post EUA studies in the next few weeks, the conduct of case control test negative designs in which we can measure real-world effectiveness selecting specific populations, and we are thinking very much indeed to select long-term care facilities in those studies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen, and then we are going to start discussing the voting question. You're muted.
Still can't hear you, Amanda. Amanda, we can't hear you.
Okay, I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was wondering if you could tell us what the timelines may be for authorization or approval in the other countries that you have enrolled trial participants in, which are Argentina, Brazil, Germany, South Africa, and Turkey. And if what is the plan in terms of those countries, people continuing in this placebo randomized controlled design versus unblinding those participants as well at the same time as unblinding in the U.S.?
Bill, please take that.
Yeah, I think the brief answer is, again, our whole unblinding process is going to be done in cooperation with regulatory authorities, both here as well as elsewhere. I think we will take into account national recommendations as well as local recommendations. So it is conceivable that we would be in a position to continue individuals in a placebo-controlled fashion, in a blinded way in those countries. But we have to be mindful of the fact of our ethical obligations regardless of geography. And so it's going to involve a balance. If there's subtle differences, that's going to be probably easier for us to make those sorts of adjustments than if, take healthcare providers. Chances are we might be providing this healthcare providers, across the board. But this is something we'll, engage in based on our conversation with regulatory authorities, both foreign and domestic.
Okay, thank you. We are now going to close discussion of the discussion items and move on to discussion of the voting question. And could we bring up the voting question? So anybody who has their hands raised now should lower them, because the next discussion is going to be about the voting question. And Mike, can you bring that up? I think we better see it before we start talking about it. Wording is very important. And I will even read it, even though you can all read it. Based on the totality of scientific evidence available, do the benefits of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine outweigh its risks for use in individuals 16 years of age and older? Okay. Amanda, are you asking to be recognized again? Or is
yes,
this the
thank
old
you.
one?
Nope, this is a new one. I got my hand up quickly this time.
Okay, let's start with you.
I just wanted to comment that I do believe that the benefits outweigh the risks. I think that some language that I would prefer be added to this language is based on the totality of scientific evidence available at this time. And I do want to ask FDA to comment on potential other contraindications besides history of anaphylaxis to a vaccine, or warnings such as persons with a history of Bell's palsy or other things that they are including in the considerations of use.
FDA, Marion, Bill, Doron.
Hi. So this voting question is what we would like the committee to consider at this time, which is an all-inclusive authorization for ages 16 and above. If the committee has concerns that the benefit-risk balance is not able to be assessed or unfavorable, such that it would preclude inclusion of a specific subgroup, then clearly we would want to hear about that and would consider those recommendations in contraindications. or in the parameters of the population authorized for use.
The question is about groups within this 16 years of age and older, such as with some kind of underlying condition. Is that usually handled by FDA with information, warnings, labels, or something like that?
Well, it depends on what the reason for concern is. So if there is a clear risk of that would make the benefit risk balance so unfavorable that persons in that group should never be vaccinated, then that would be a contraindication. For lesser concerns, then that might merit a warning or a precaution.
Right. Is that usually something that is voted on by an advisory committee? Those specifics.
Typically, no. Those are handled through labeling.
Right. Okay. Let's go on to next, Mr. Taubman.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to ask the committee or the other members to listen to this. I'm a civil rep, so maybe I'm a good indicator of how things are perceived by the public, but I have spent a lot of time reviewing material, trying to understand the data, and in light of concerns with the data expressed by my colleagues, many commentators, and in the literature, I do have a compromise proposal that's not the whole thing that was just suggested or is in the question, but rather it would be that EUA be limited to the groups that the CDC ACIP committee has already identified as priority. And the data is limited, as we know. It's limited in so many ways. The severe disease thing that I was talking about before, it's not compelling at all. I mean, the FDA says all we can do is suggest protection from severe COVID-19 disease. We need to know that it does that. So that's one bit of data we need to get. The safety issues are only 2 months of data, and I know it's been said many times that 6 weeks is usually the amount of time before we have a problem, but this is a completely untested technology with this vaccine in humans. And then the FDA says as far as a vaccine-enhanced disease over time, that's unknown. So there's there's a few of the missing pieces of data. Given that we don't have good data on effectiveness on the thing that really matters, which is preventing severe disease, and the safety issues, and that there's a question of duration of protection, which more time would give us, I think that we absolutely need, as other people have said, phase 2 to 3 trials to continue. And we've also discussed at length how if you grant EUA broadly, then it's going to really present a problem. I know that there's workarounds, and I understand it makes sense the blinded crossover, you still are going to lose at that point thereafter the placebo benefit. It's been suggested by Pfizer and others that we can go with the standard that wait until the people in the study will only be told and unblinded or offered the crossover option if it is authorized for their particular demographic to get the vaccine at that point. But what's been talked about is state and local standards. And as Dr. Lee pointed out, that is really problematic and variable. And I can tell you as an advocate on the state level, we can lobby successfully to get things changed on the state level. And maybe that's not so good. Maybe you need a clear standard of EUA. And as I pointed out earlier, a lot of the trial participants who are writing to us and complaining are viewing if EUA is granted, and that means I should get it. We can disagree with that. But clearly, if EUA is officially granted initially only for the 2 high-risk groups, which is identified by the CDC, which was the healthcare workers and the nursing home residents to start, that will give us time, give FDA time to review more thoroughly the data. It can be just a few weeks. And they could either come back to this committee or on their own decide, okay, we now have enough to go forward and expand it to a larger population. And the reason I'm suggesting is obviously, because the risk-benefit analysis changes, and you're talking about the high-risk populations versus the rest, given all the uncertainty. And the other piece of it is that we know there's just not enough to go around. So even if you agree to what I'm saying, it makes no difference in terms of what's going to happen on the ground in terms of getting vaccine out, because it's only going to go initially to the healthcare workers and the nursing home residents anyway. But the reason why I think it's important is that it will allow FDA the opportunity to get real data. I did ask for the data since November 14th to today just on severe disease. We know there were only 10 cases before November 14th, and I couldn't get, when I asked, more recent data. I'm sure Pfizer today, right now, knows how many severe cases there were since November 14th in both groups. But that's the kind of data we really need to see, I think, and that's why I'm suggesting this.
Doron?
Yeah, I'd like to make one point about this question of severe disease. I think it's important, and it was covered to some extent at the last VRBPAC meeting in October. And that's that we have ample experience of examples of vaccines that protect just as well, if not better, against severe disease as they do against mild to moderate disease. And so protection against disease of any severity is actually a pretty good predictor of protection against severe disease. We have a pretty strong result in terms of efficacy with this vaccine based on the available data. And those data that we do have for severe disease are all pointing in the right direction and corroborate what history has shown us. I think that's important to...
Not only that, as we will get more data as we start using the vaccine more extensively, because with rare outcomes, you have to start using the vaccine in order to see them under proper circumstances. I'd like to move on to Dr. Meisner has got the next question.
Thank you. I would like to concur with what Dr. Fink just said, that if a vaccine prevents mild disease, I think we can assume it will prevent severe disease. So I understand that's the most important endpoint, but because of the rarity of the disease, severe disease, it may be difficult to reach that. The other point I wanted to make about long-term safety. We know about the safety of this vaccine through 60 days. And it's pretty hard to think of a vaccine reaction that occurs after 60 days. And I looked through the vaccine injury table for conventional vaccines, and all of the injuries, except for one, were only up to 6 weeks, not even 8 weeks. The one exception was a polio vaccine, a live polio vaccine administered to an immunocompromised host, and this is obviously not a live vaccine. So I think we cannot, no one could say that there is no long-term enhanced immunity when the vaccinee experiences the vaccine. But to me, that I think the safety is pretty well demonstrated, and balance that against over 2,000 deaths a day or 2,500 deaths a day, I'm comfortable. I would, if I can make one more point, Arnold, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yes, I am uncomfortable about the question as it's written. I do not believe we have sufficient data for 16 and 17-year-olds. I would prefer to say for use in individuals 18 years of age and older. 16 and 17-year-old children, as we saw, or adolescents, do not get very sick, seldom get hospitalized, and I'll bet it's a very small number of deaths.
Bill, would you like to make a comment? And then I think we should talk about the 16 and 17-year-olds specifically. Bill?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a specific comment about vaccine safety and duration of follow-up. because I think one of the important things to remember when we're rolling out a vaccine to many people is that it's not just the side effects that the vaccine is causing that are important, but it may also be the vaccine side effects that are attributed to vaccine, but which the vaccine didn't actually cause, that are important. And that's one of the reasons why we typically do follow people in clinical trials for 6 months or more, and where that placebo-controlled follow-up can be very important in showing that whatever happened in the vaccine group also happened in the placebo group, because that's our best way of knowing. And very often it's the fact that we have that placebo-controlled follow-up over time that gives us the ability to say that the vaccine didn't cause something at a longer period of time after vaccination. One could in fact argue that one could even get more placebo-controlled safety follow-up over the shorter run, which then could expand the total safety database. This was proposed at a WHO meeting a few weeks ago, where as long as vaccine supplies are limited, there shouldn't be a prohibition against getting additional placebo-controlled follow-up in people who don't have immediate eligibility for vaccine, and that then could expand the safety database to a much larger number than even what one is capable of doing in these trials. But very often these kinds of studies work very much to the benefit of the manufacturers, because if one has this data, it actually allows one to say fairly definitively that a side effect that somebody thinks the vaccine is causing is not being caused by the vaccine. And of course, this is something that is a big concern with rapid rollout of a vaccine. This kind of thing caused big problems in 1975, 1976. The swine flu vaccine, where there were rapid cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, where if there were more placebo-controlled data, one might even have been able to address that at a different level, although that would have required very many patients. But I'm just pointing out that it's not just the 2 months follow-up in these phase 3 trials, which are important, but really placebo-controlled safety follow-up can play a big role in helping us determine what the vaccine doesn't cause, which is often at least as important as our ability to determine what it does cause.
Thank you, Dr. Cross.
Thank you. Does anybody in particular want to talk about the 16 and 17-year-old issue? I think that's an important one to get settled, because it may be affecting how people would like to vote on this.
Yes, this is Ofer Levy. I want to speak to that issue. Is that okay?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
And then Dr. Gans.
Yeah, so a complicated topic, and it can be argued either way. Cody correctly pointed out that the incidence of severe COVID at 16, 17 years of age is not high. On the other hand, we've already heard from Pfizer, and this is quite typical, that if they do eventually want to get a pediatric indication, and the end game could look, we don't know, we don't have a crystal ball, but it's possible if you demonstrate safety in pediatrics that eventually you get this as a pediatric vaccine and it's incorporated into the pediatric immunization schedule. That is a very practical model, because that's how most vaccines are distributed around the world, through the infrastructure of vaccinology. So in terms of achieving population penetration. So the loss, if we take away the 16 and 17-year-olds here, we lose what is the effort to climb down in age eventually, and we might lose one of our tools to eventually really conquer this pandemic. So I'm not so sanguine about removing that group.
Dr. Gans.
Can I respond?
Dr. Meister, go ahead. Yep,
yes,
go ahead.
Thank you, Ofer. It's a very interesting point. So I think you're suggesting that if the 16 and 17-year-old subjects are not included, then that will delay a approval or authorization for young children? I don't think that's the case. You're muted.
Phone is muted. Okay, hi. It will reduce the amount of information we have about the 16 and 17-year-olds. It will slow down getting the vaccine to them, and if we don't have that information, makes it that much harder to go down in age beyond that. So I'm thinking about what the end game here is for the entire world. You know, what's realistic here, as we know, these viruses don't know national borders. What's realistic is, you know, getting vaccines eventually that are safe and effective through the typical vaccine infrastructure in the world. Most vaccines are delivered in early life.
But does the, but we don't know if the benefit outweighs the risk in that 2-year age group over.
Yeah,
okay,
but it's
there were, let me interrupt. There were data in our briefing documents about studies going down to, I think, 12 years of age. If anything, there were larger numbers there than in some of the in the 16 and 17-year-olds. Anybody?
I'm sorry, Dr. Levy, I don't know why are you saying that a vaccine would have to have an emergency use authorization in 16-year-olds when where they're not going to be in the group that's going to get the vaccine. They're not going to be prioritized, but they'll continue to be studied in the trial. So I don't see how this interferes with the eventual full licensure for that age group.
I think that's the important point here is like when they come into the phase. I think it's very important to study this group, and I think that we will have ongoing data on them. The question is, does the risk-benefit actually outweigh it at this point? And being a pediatrician, and Ofer knows this very well, I'm obviously a big proponent of any kind of studies that we can get into children, and we certainly need it for herd immunity. But they're not going to be first in line, and I do think we should allow the studies to continue that have been proposed and probably allow the people who have already been vaccinated to actually have full safety data. So I would support not including them in this round.
Other pediatricians? Dr. Sawyer, did you have something you were?
Yes,
Dr. Chatterjee?
Thank you. I've been trying to get in for a while to put in a word in it.
Yeah, well, it's hard.
I agree completely with what Dr. Gans and Dr. Meissner said. I have the same concern, which is among all the scientific data presented, I thought that the thinnest was for the 16 and 17-year-olds who, if they were eligible under this EUA, would not be granting permission themselves. You know, their parents are responsible, so they're not making the decision themselves, decision themselves to get vaccinated or not. The other group I had concerns with was the people who are 75 and older, but because of the very high risk for that group, I think it's reasonable to not put an upper limit on the age, but I too would vote for putting that age limit up to 18 and older.
This is Mark. I would like to just join that lineup of people advocating for that. I think the data is very thin and that it's inadequate to really say we have safety given the low incidence of disease. I know the argument was they're going to be going off to college, but I'm not sure how many are going to receive vaccine between now and then given the staging of release of vaccines. So I would favor delay.
Dr. Rubin, and then I'm going to ask FDA to respond. I think you're muted.
I'm not a pediatrician, so I say this with some trepidation, but we're looking at lots of subgroups here. And I think we don't want to lose sight of, we're very focused on safety, as we should be, because these are healthy people, but the efficacy is overwhelming for this vaccine. It's very, very strong. And remember that we're going to be voting, if we vote for this, to approve this for Native Americans, and there were very few of those, for nursing home residents, which weren't in the study at all, and we think that it's likely to work as compared, and it's likely to be safe because what we know, there are more 16 and 17-year-olds in the study than there are Native Americans, I suspect, and I'm not sure why we wouldn't want to provide clinicians the option of using those. Some of these kids are working in supermarkets and are going to be AMTs and going to be essential workers. So I hate to take that tool away from clinicians.
Can I comment, Arnold?
Yes, please, and then we want to hear from FDA what they would suggest at this point.
Thank you very much for your comment, Dr. Fink. I think the difference, for example, between American Indians and children is American Indians have a high rate of disease. 16 and 17-year-old children do not have high rates of disease. So it becomes a risk-benefit balance that worries me.
Arnold, at
Okay.
some point, as another pediatrician, I'd like to chime in as the last pediatrician to chime in. Here's what I would say. I think I support the statement actually as written. I think it's never an issue of when do you know everything. The question is when do you know enough. But we certainly know that this vaccine is highly effective for 3 months after dose 1. We know that we have a lot of safety data and can say, as Cody pointed out, that at least we don't have a relatively uncommon serious side effect problem. And in terms of safety, we're going to be doing follow-up to make sure that issues like bells or anaphylaxis will be attended to. I mean, the fact of the matter is 16 and 17-year-olds can get this infection, and when they get it, I mean, we've seen certainly reports as well as children in our hospital who have had cardiac anomalies as 16 and 17-year-olds. And if you can prevent this disease safely and effectively, I mean, we have clear evidence of benefit, and all we have on the other side is theoretical risk. So I frankly would support this as written, and I agree with Dr. Rubin.
Can I respond to Paul? Arnold, I think.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, Paul, the rates of MIS-C, at least as far as we know, and as was published in the New England Journal regarding New York State, the rates of MIS-C were 2 cases per 100,000 people under 20 years of age.
Right, but I'm not just saying this C. I mean, there is also vasculitis that doesn't necessarily meet the operational criteria for MIS-C.
Well, and that is certainly true, but I'm just saying that the rate of disease is so small and we know so little in this age group. It's real. Believe me, we've had them too. But I have a little more trouble justifying it in children who are so unlikely to get disease.
Can we hear somebody from FDA, Doron or Phil?
Amanda's a pediatrician.
Comment on this? No, I'd just like to hear what, or Marion, come on.
Okay, this is Marion. So I think, I really don't want to throw in my own opinion on this. I hear the committee's concern. I just think that, as Dr. Fink has discussed earlier on, our laws, regulations do also permit, extrapolations to younger age groups, and we have been, I think, pretty forthcoming even in our briefing document that we would support, an extrapolation. One should also, consider that 16 and 17-year-olds are out there. They may, transmit disease. And the last comment that I wanted to make on this one is really, if the argument is made that 16 and 17 years old are really not the ones who are high-risk group and who would get in line to get this disease because they're not within the recommended group, I think you can make the same argument for an 18 to 25-year-old. So to me, I don't find that compelling. I wonder, however, looking at it is 5:30, and Arnold, we have a strategy. I would like, provided that other committee members do no longer want to weigh in. I would like for the committee to really vote on this question as is, to really hear, because we have 23 members, and I would like to see the results, and then we go to next. Arnold, that's my recommendation.
Okay, that is, thank you very much. I was hoping for some direction because we are moving around in circles right now. So we are going to move to the vote. And again, the process is going to be this. We will vote on our computers. The votes will be announced, and then we will have an explanation of vote from those who wish to give an explanation of their vote. Okay? Kathleen, am I correct in the process?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Monteau. So our members and temporary voting members that you'll be able to see on this slide, excluding the industry representative, will be voting in this meeting. And in regards to the voting process, Dr. Monteau, as you mentioned, you'll read the question for the record, and then afterwards, all members and temporary voting members will cast their vote by selecting one of the voting options, which will include yes, no, or abstain. You'll have 2 minutes to cast your vote after the question is read, and once all of the votes have been placed, we will broadcast the results and read the individual votes aloud for the record. So just please note that you have 2 minutes, the time frame, and you can change your vote within that period of time, but after the vote has closed, all votes will be considered final. So are there any questions related to voting?
Kathleen, can I ask a question? Cody Meissner? Yes.
Please.
I want to vote for this vaccine. I just would like to remove the 16 to 6. I don't want to vote against the EUA just because I'm uncomfortable with 16. Can we modify the wording if this doesn't pass?
I think that's what Dr. Gruber was saying. Mariam, would you confirm that?
Yes.
I thought we just said we were not going to modify the wording so that we could get to a vote.
I would recommend voting on this question as is for now, because we have not heard from all the committee members.
Thank you, Dr. Gruber.
Kathleen, can I ask one last question before we vote? The way
if it's related to the voting process, sure.
Well, it
only
is.
About the voting process, not the question. Okay, I think we are going to vote. So
great. So let's pull up the voting question on the slide, and Dr. Monteau, you can read question for the record.
Based on the totality of scientific evidence available, do the benefits of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine outweigh its risks for use in individuals 16 years of age and older? Your vote possibilities are yes or no, and if you want to abstain, you just don't vote. Is that it? Because I thought there was an abstention possibility.
There's an abstain selection. The no vote just shows your name if you haven't made a selection.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes to vote.
Yes, go ahead and please cast your vote.
How do we return the vote to you? Can you see what we've voted?
Yes, once you select the radio button, I can see the votes. Mm-hmm. We have 1 minute remaining. Thirty seconds. Okay, at this time, the 2 minutes is up, so if we could please close the vote and broadcast the results. And I will read the votes aloud for the record. Dr. Moore voted yes. Dr. Cohn voted yes. Dr. Gans voted yes. Dr. Perlman voted yes. Dr. Kurilla voted no. Dr. Rubin voted yes. Dr. Levy voted yes. Dr. Pergam voted yes. Dr. Chatterjee voted no. Dr. Fuller voted no. Dr. Miser abstained. Dr. Sawyer voted yes. Dr. Hildreth voted yes. Dr. Kim voted no. Dr. Monto voted yes. Dr. Tripp voted yes. Dr. Wharton voted yes. Dr. Benacoloke voted yes. Dr. Offit voted yes. Dr. McInnes voted yes. Dr. Lee voted yes. Mr. Taubman voted yes. And that concludes the vote. So we do have a favorable vote, and that concludes this portion of the meeting. So I will now hand the meeting back over to Dr. Monto. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Marion, do you have anything you want to add at this point?
We can't hear you, Marion.
I apologize, double muted. I just wanted to thank the committee for voting on this very complex topic. I wanted to thank the committee for their discussion and their suggestions. We very much appreciate their input on this very important topic, and we will take what we've heard today into consideration when deciding on not only the EUA issuance here, but also, how to move on in the development of and licensure of this product. Thank you so much.
And therefore, our work for the day is done. I wanted to thank the committee, and I want especially to thank the FDA because they have been laboring long and hard in doing the analysis, dealing with some of the issues such as the recent anaphylaxis episodes. And I will therefore close the meeting, and I believe most of us are going to be revisiting some of these issues in about a week. So thank you very much. Good night, and see you soon.
It's so you have limited data